This is the
Five Stars
podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Hi.
So, what do you guys want to talk about? Tell me when I'm telling lies.
Thanks, guys. Back to you.
The things I do to make my viewers happy. I think I said the same thing on Monday's show. Oh, it's true. I was not planning on recording anything out of town this week. I legitimately had it in my schedule to record all three of these reviews on Sunday night so I could throw the editing together on Friday when I got back to Worcester. Then I would upload everything that night. And somewhere along the way, I decided that I was not in the mood to put myself through that kind of anguish. So I'm going to do it the normal way. I'm going to delegate recording sessions out throughout the week, and I'll go through my normal editing process on Thursday. Then hopefully when I get back into Ohio on Friday, I'll be able to have this uploaded in the regular time slot. Normally I would probably just have not done a show altogether. But we didn't do a Friday show a couple weeks ago. Plus it's the WrestleWar recap, and I definitely don't want to skip out on that. I was half tempted to just do the WrestleWar pay-per-view and nothing else, but I decided that I was going to proceed as normal. So you're getting it all today. You're welcome. It's the Five Starr Wrestling Report. We are the wrestling podcast nobody knows but everybody needs. Here on YouTube and Rumble on Mondays and Fridays for all the fun classic wrestling coverage. Make sure if you're checking out the show for the first time that you subscribe, comment, and like. I do apologize in advance for the reduced tone, but I am in a hotel room as I'm recording this, and it is reasonably late. So I'm trying to be respectful to all the neighbors. I've done hotel reviews before, and it's always kind of sketchy because I never know who's on the other side. So it's probably a good sign that we should get into the reviews. Try not to make this any longer than absolutely necessary. And we've already got plenty to talk about with the recap, so let's get going. And we'll dive right into the WrestleWar recap from the Municipal Auditorium in Nashville, Tennessee. The pay-per-view that appeared on my front doorstep a lot quicker than I realized. Man, it doesn't seem long ago that we were sitting here covering the Chi-Town Rumble. Now here we are in May of '89 getting to talk about the third and final Flair Steamboat encounter. What a classic trilogy they had. And, everything else on the card, which was pretty much exactly that. Everything else. Let's be honest. There's basically one, arguably two things on this pay-per-view that people look back on and remember. I say arguably because while the Flair Steamboat match itself was excellent, the afterbirth sort of overshadowed the work in the match. And I think I said at one point that the third match in the series was probably my least favorite of the three. Doesn't imply it was a bad match, just not my favorite in their title series. Probably the least memorable. Now they advertised 9 matches for the card. Looking back, I'm not exactly sure why we needed 9 matches. I mean, they could have easily cut 3 or 4 of them, and it really wouldn't hurt the show at all. In fact, it probably would have enhanced it. Like take the opener as an example. Did we really need a 3-minute Doug Gilbert Great Muta squash? I mean, I like Muta, but it's not like anybody woke up the next day and remembered this match ever happened. And this kind of fell into the same trap I think Muta's match from the Superdome did last month at the Clash. They were in a southern market that didn't really get Muta. So instead of booing him like a traditional heel and or cheering him because of all the cool athletic stuff he was doing, the fans just kind of sat on their hands for several minutes. Didn't really react to much. The one thing I did find funny is seeing Eddie Gilbert come out to try to cheerlead his brother, but he came out like 90 seconds into the match. So he's only out there for another minute and a half, and then Muta just hits his moonsault onto Doug and pins him flat. Now the people pop when they saw Eddie come out, but then Muta won almost immediately. So I'm sitting there like, what was the point? Just to get the cheap babyface pop? I mean, there was a brief stare down between Eddie and Muta afterward. I guess that's all the creative genius needed to set up feuds now in the land of WCW. We'll just have two guys gawk at each other and there's your next feud. So yeah, I don't really know why that match was needed. Nor do I know why Butch Reed versus Ranger Ross was needed. Before I talk about that though, I do want to point out that it was good to see Lance Russell. I'm not even sure how many people knew that he was under a WCW contract during this time. He was actually doing commentary for NWA Worldwide at one point. I don't believe it lasted all that long. It's criminal to think that Lance never got the opportunity to work as a color guy with JR in one of the Saturday syndicated shows. One of the all-time great commentators in wrestling. Poor Lance was relegated to either interview positions or commentary roles on the B and C shows. Like, he never even got the chance to do play-by-play on a pay-per-view. Just wasted money. Like his interview with Ric Flair was one of those generic what are your thoughts type questions. Really not a whole lot of interaction between them. Just stood there and casually held the mic while Flair did the promo on Steamboat. Again, though, it's good to see Lance on camera, if only for a short window on the pay-per-view. The match here with Reed and Ross was fine. Again, more suited for something that probably should have been kept on television, as opposed to making people pay to see the match. The big standout here was Teddy Long coming out in his pimp outfit, taking notes on the match. He had a visitor's pass, despite him being allegedly fired from WCW in storyline. See, that's where I was confused. I thought he was only terminated as a WCW official. No, apparently he was fired from the company altogether. Which makes this particular moment a hell of a lot dumber. I mean, nothing happened. He just stood and watched at ringside as Butch made easy work of Ross and then pinned him with a flying shoulder block. And we have been covering the fact that Teddy eventually switches over to becoming Reed's manager, so they're obviously setting the seats for all that. I just don't entirely get the logic of, you're no longer employed with the company and storyline, yet you are still able to just casually come out and watch as there's a match going on because you have a fake visitor's pass. No, that's a level of forethought being put into continuity here in 1989. We, the audience, are so stupid, we're not going to see that none of this makes a damn lick of sense. Whatever. Hey, remember when Ranger Ross debuted and they were talking about how this guy was going to be a future breakout star in wrestling? So far, that's coming off like a load of hot garbage. And so that brought us to the Texas Bull Rope match between Dick Murdoch and Bob Orton Jr. One of the few matches they actually spent time building up on television. So, not only is this grudge match third on the card, but it goes less than 5 minutes and change, and is also subsequently one of the most boring bull rope matches I think I've ever seen in my life. In addition to there being no blood, the entire match was mostly Bob Orton ducking cowbell shots from Murdoch. At one point, Dickie went to take off his cowboy boots so he could hit Orton over the head with it several times. Then fast forward like a minute later, he hog ties Orton's ankles with a rope, drops a couple elbows on him, and then falls on top of him to pin his shoulders down. It was, directly as I wrote here, the most PG bull rope match ever contested in a professional wrestling ring. It actually kind of goes back to the whole conversation about me not remembering Dick Murdoch or Bob Orton being around in 1989. Well, now I see why my memories are so foggy. It's because they had a lame match third on the card that barely went 5 minutes. Like, even as they shot the heat angle afterwards where the heels attacked Murdoch and did the hangman's rope spot to try to choke him out, I mean, that had more heat than anything that happened in the whole match. It also seemed to indicate that the program is going to continue, which, not exactly clamoring to see that. It's weird to think, though, at the time they were getting ready to head into the fourth match, we were a little over the half-hour mark into the pay-per-view. You know, compare that to modern WWE where we'd probably only be halfway through match one if we were at the 30-minute point in the show. Of course, you got to account for all the ring entrances and the other hubbub filler in between. At least they kept things moving back during this period. So we get the Samoan SWAT team versus the Dynamic Dudes. 20 seconds into the match, the fans broke out into a Paulie sucks chant. I swear to God, I thought they were chanting Johnny sucks. I was like, they've officially turned on poor Johnny Ace. My sympathy levels are incredibly low. This is our first time covering the Dynamic Dudes. I don't know if they had already debuted on TV prior to the actual pay-per-view. I recall JR briefly hyping up their debut on last week's TBS episode. You know, for those that aren't fully aware of the background with the Dynamic Dudes, it's Shane Douglas and Johnny Ace. And whereas you could point the finger of blame on guys like Jim Herd for a lot of the rotten gimmick ideas we were getting in WCW around this time, well, this one you can't even blame Jim Herd for it, because he wasn't the brainchild. It was actually a Jim Ross concept, because he wanted to try to replicate some version of the Rock and Roll Express. You know, the good-looking hip young tag team with the crazy color patterns that could appeal to all the younger kids. And because skateboarding was the big fad back in the 80s and 90s, well, they just figured, let's have them be skateboarders, and it'll get over with the younger population. the Utes. And you know what's actually quite wild? This is where some revisionist historians would salivate at proving the old-timers wrong. You know, people often look back and scoff at the Dynamic Dudes, and for obviously good reason. The gimmick was terrible. But there is this narrative that's gone around for years that the Dynamic Dudes were never over, that the fans immediately rejected the gimmick when they first saw it. That's actually not entirely true. They didn't get exposed until way later on when they were feuding with the Midnight Express. And especially when they were working in front of smarter crowds where the fans were super anti-Dynamic Dudes. The people actually were really into Shane and Johnny in this match. They popped for all the babyface spots. They popped for the finish when they got the upset win over the Samoans. I mean, you've heard stories over time about kids not liking Johnny Ace and Shane Douglas during the fan greets and all that stuff. And there's definitely a modicum of truth to that. But it wasn't an outright rejection from day one where everybody saw through the gimmick and said, "Nah, this is bogus. We hate this." I think people started to realize how bad it was when they saw the fact that Johnny Ace couldn't actually wrestle for shit. And the fact that he couldn't actually ride a skateboard. In the ring, they were never anything to write home about. But it's not like they were the worst workers on the roster by that point. And even though I really didn't find much value in the match, I mean, the Nashville fans were very much into it. Johnny Ace is the worst babyface in peril I think I've ever seen. But that's beside the point. It's a very simple, basic tag match where the babyfaces got to do some of their flashy stuff early on. And let's be honest, by they, I mean Shane Douglas, because he was the only athletic of the two partners. Johnny sold for a while. He eventually made the hot tag to Douglas after Paulie got on the house mic and said that Johnny's as worthless as all the Nashville broads. I think that might have been a cue spot for Johnny to finally get the hot tag and take the fucking thing home. Because the heat lasted for a very long time. The Samoans gave Douglas a big splash for a near fall. Then they did a breakdown spot at the end where the heels tried to shit can Johnny. And when Samu went up to pick up Douglas for a front power slam, Johnny hit a missile drop kick, which sent Douglas down on top of Samu for the flash pin. And like I said, the people went crazy for that. You know, it's sad to think that the Midnight Express weren't capable of ever beating the Samoans on live pay-per-view. But the Dynamic fucking Dudes show up in their first big showcase match and manage to knock off the unbeatable heels. I don't want to make it sound like I'm coming to the defense of the Dudes. And I just don't want to blatantly underplay the fact that they did get cheered at one point. You know, so for all the people saying that Johnny and Shane were the most unpopular babyface tag team of all time, it's not entirely factual. They became incredibly unpopular with the fans. It just took time and exposure. So then we had a quick interview with the three judges that were going to be part of the main event with Flair and Steamboat. That's Lou Thez, Pat O'Connor, and Terry Funk. And they just kind of laid out what their roles were going to be. They're calling balls and strikes. Nothing more, nothing less. They're only there to make an official call should the match go to a time limit draw. But they're not going to let their idiosyncratic opinions get in the way of objectivism. It's about proving who the better man is. Famous last words, I know. May as well just put up a screen cap that read, "Swerve incoming." But that took us to Michael Hayes versus Lex Luger for the U.S. Heavyweight title. Probably should have done a better job coordinating ring gear for the show. Seeing two guys wearing the exact same shade of blue when they're supposed to be opponents, it's kind of visually off-putting. Especially when they're both blonde. With that said, we know the backstory based on the TV shows we've covered. You know, Hayes and Luger randomly being paired together as a tag team for one of the local house shows a couple months back. And it was during that event where Hayes stabbed Luger in the back and turned heel on him. It was actually one of the last things we saw involving Barry Windham before he left for the WWF. And the whole turn itself kind of came across very contrived. You know, we talked about it when they shot it. It's almost as if they realized that they didn't have any opponents lined up for Luger after he had beaten Barry for the title earlier in the year. So they're scrambling like, quick, who can we have Luger feud with? Fuck it, let's turn Hayes. And the program's been fine. I always prefer heel Michael Hayes over babyface Michael Hayes, so I was more than okay with the heel turn. You know, with that said, it's also coming with the knowledge that they're about to turn Luger heel this summer, which kind of made everything about this match very confusing up to and including the finish. And I will admit, especially when you look at the parties involved here, this is not a bad match. In fact, I would say it was reasonably good. Definitely one of the better Michael Hayes singles bouts you'll ever see. The people were totally behind Luger, and we worked over Hayes early on and spent the first several minutes just dominating him. Had the classic Michael Hayes selling and chicken shit stalling. And then eventually Luger tried for a running charge and ended up splatting on the outside ring mat. God. You know, I'll say one thing. Considering all the health complications with Luger later on in life, the spinal fusion, him becoming wheelchair bound, like you go back and watch footage of him taking bumps on the ring mat in the manner he did here, it's crazy to think his body didn't break down a whole lot sooner. I mean, we've seen Luger take that insane bump before. There's no way he could have possibly protected himself during that. I mean, he just threw all of his body weight toward the ropes and landed in a heap on the outside padding. And he was landing on the small of his back, too. I don't know how he ever thought that wasn't going to destroy his body. Just an incredibly stupid bump to take. And so Hayes used that to capitalize and worked over Luger for a while. We had Luger fighting back at the end and giving Hayes the 3 big press slams before he tried to set him up for the torture rack. And then as Hayes slipped out and gave Luger the DDT, they attempted to do a ref bump spot with Nick Patrick where Luger shot Hayes into the ropes, and he was supposed to collide with Patrick to set up the angle where Terry Gordy came out to help Hayes get on top of Luger for the pin. The actual ref bump execution was poor. Patrick basically got nudged by Hayes' shoulder. Then he fell down to the mat like someone shot him in the arm with a rifle. But of course, it set up the deal where Gordy showed up and helped Hayes cover Luger for the pin, despite Luger trying to get his foot under the bottom rope. But Gordy shoved it off and Patrick never saw it and just counted the 3 anyway. So yeah, Michael Hayes is the new United States Heavyweight Champion. I have to assume that's a short-term title reign because, I mean, we're like a month or 2 out from Luger's feud with Steamboat. And I know for a fact that that was a program over the U.S. strap. So, I don't know how long Hayes carries the belt, but it can't be any longer than a month. I'm also still trying to recollect how they went about turning Luger heel in the process. Was that how he captured the title? He turned heel on Hayes? Why do I have a sinking suspicion that's exactly how this is all playing out? Maybe I remember more about this than I'm giving myself credit for. In any case, I don't remember a damn thing about Hayes as the U.S. champion. So this must have been a blink and you miss it short title reign. Aside from the weird finish, like I said, I thoroughly enjoyed the match. If you would have asked me ahead of time, what would be the second best match on the WrestleWar pay-per-view behind Steamboat and Flair? Never would have suspected Hayes versus Luger. But fuck me if it wasn't the second best match on the entire card. It sure wasn't Sting versus the Iron Sheik for the television title. By the way, how about that Stinger spray tan? Good Lord. He made Donald Trump jealous of the color orange. So, well, here's the thing. Do y'all remember that comment I made last week on the TBS review when I said, there's no possible way that Sting versus the Iron Sheik went any longer than 2 minutes? Well, I was partially wrong. It went 2 minutes and 12 seconds. So I was essentially right. Sheiky tried to jumpstart Sting before the bell. He had a very brief flurry of heat on him before Sting shot Sheik off into the corner. Stinger splash. Scorpion deathlock. It was about as painless as you could possibly hope for. Meaning that the match wasn't good, but it wasn't horrendous. And I wish I had anything else to add beyond that, but I really don't. It was a glorified squash. But it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier at the beginning of the review. Not really something I would have put on pay-per-view. I mean, I can get behind wanting to have Sting on the card, but if all it was going to equate to was a 2-minute squash with a guy with bad knees and a bad back, why even bother at that point? But I don't want to get hung up on all that. Let's talk about Flair and Steamboat for the world title. Surprisingly, the match that did not main event the pay-per-view. Which is kind of strange. They still had 2 other matches that followed this one. Plus the big angle. And, well, I can assure you of one thing. If you weren't already sick of Bonnie and Little Richie being rammed up your sphincter hole by now, you were by the time you saw them come out for Ricky's entrance. Dude. Oh, God. When they had Richie come out on that fucking pony, there's Bonnie doing the queen wave in her sequin red dress. This is where I wrote, there is not a camera in the world that Bonnie Steamboat did not want to have her face plastered in front of. She seriously thought she was a fucking somebody. Unreal. I was so done with the Family Man story at this point, dude. The amount of times I've seen Bonnie and Richie try to hog the spotlight. I mean, poor Richie was fucking 2. He had no say in it. But God, Bonnie. She had such go-away heat. Not just with me. The majority of wrestling fans. No wonder fans were split 50-50 with the Flair Steamboat chants. It's all Bonnie's fault. I mean, at this point, these guys could basically have a match in their sleep. While it's still not my favorite of the 3 bouts in their series, it is still a fantastic world title match. I mean, the chemistry these two had together was otherworldly. And they put the attention on the panel judges throughout the match, but it wasn't one of those things where they were constantly having to remind you that they were out there. So it never detracted from the action. But at the same time, it left you with that lingering suspicion that because they were out there, maybe they were going to wind up going to another hour Broadway, which would have necessitated the judges making the final call. It was cool, though, because, at the 15-minute mark, Byron Scott had gone over to collect the judges' current scorecards, and then he brought them over to JR and Bob Caudle to let us all know that, Ricky was in the driver's seat up to that point. So they were kind of treating it like a real sports competition where they were calculating points in real time based on who was in offensive control through most of the match up to that point. And like later on when Flair was in control of the pace, then you saw Funk and O'Connor give the edge to Flair. And I'll admit, I didn't sit here and take meticulous notes on everything spot for spot. The main story of everything was pretty much centered around both guys trying to fight for the advantage and win over the judges' approval. I mean, things didn't really kick into a higher gear until the last several minutes after Steamboat had tried to go up top and hit Flair with a big cross body dive. But as he was getting ready to launch himself, Flair shook the ropes, which sent Steamboat out to the floor. And then he came up favoring his knee. I mean, the bump itself was fantastic. Steamboat did a great job making it look like he recklessly fell out to the floor. And then once Steamboat came up selling the knee, Flair worked him over for several minutes, put Steamboat in the figure 4, kept working the leg over until he wound up catching Ricky in a small package and more or less getting the clean win. So Flair becomes a 6-time world champion at the time of this event. And as they're setting off the pyro afterwards and basically giving him the superstar treatment, already in the back of your mind you're thinking, it's a bit odd for them to be running with the babyface Ric Flair all of a sudden. It was a good teaser, kind of making you think, they might be setting up something. And then, of course, he helps Steamboat up and raises his arm. So he did cement a face turn, regardless of the fact that 80% of the audience was already cheering him. And we all know Flair's backstory when it came to him never wanting to be a true babyface on camera. I mean, he tried to fight that uphill battle every step of the way. But all in all, I thought it was a great culmination to the Flair-Steamboat rivalry. I don't remember people being outraged at the time that Steamboat had dropped the belt back to Flair so quickly after winning it. I also don't recall people being sick of Ric Flair on top, even by 1989. To me, it was always the right decision. I mean, Steamboat was never going to be a long-reigning world champion. I mean, you had to put the belt on him in order to establish him as a top babyface when he showed up in January of that year. But Steamboat was never the kind of guy that needed to hold onto the strap for 6 months to a year. Honestly, I think it would have actually hurt his career had they done that. Especially with how flaky the fans were around this point. They were already starting to wear thin of the family man routine. I don't think white meat, good Christian babyface Ricky had a lot of steam behind it. No pun intended. It also doesn't account for the fact that Ricky didn't even last an entire year with the NWA before he left. But that's a story we'll talk about on a later date. What it set up afterwards was the big news bulletin, though. And it's an angle that still gets a lot of recognition to this day. People still talk about the Flair Funk piledriver angle and everything it led to as a result, so what do you say we talk about it? We have JR in the ring to do an interview with Flair. Again, total babyface promo from Flair, putting over Steamboat, talking about how he's the greatest world champion he's ever faced. He's proud to represent the NWA as a 6-time world champion. And as he's doing the big hoorah speech, here comes Terry Funk to congratulate Flair in person. And immediately you can just sense the condescending demeanor with Funk here. You know, he's trying to act all excited for Flair and be all chummy with him. But you know deep down that he's plotting something. So he eventually issues the challenge to Flair for the world title, which Flair responds by saying, "Terry, you're a great wrestler, but you haven't done anything to prove that you should be at the top list of contenders right now." Which is partially true if you consider that, I mean, Funk had basically been out of wrestling for a few years at that point. So Flair's trying to rationally explain to him, I've got a laundry list of contenders that are champing at the bit for a title shot. You're great, Terry, but you're not next in line. And so this sends Terry off the deep end. And right as he tells Flair that he was kidding about the whole title challenge thing, well, that's when Flair let his guard down. And Funk blindsides him with a left hook. And we get crazy, out of control Terry Funk as he's laying into Flair on the concrete floor, beating the ever-loving piss out of him, cutting promos on the fans. And he eventually drags Flair over to the timekeeper's table, where he gives Flair the big pile driver. You know, Flair's selling his neck as Funk grabs a chair and whacks him over the back of the head while he's pinned down underneath the table rubble. And then Funk goes over to Jim and says one of the classic lines, "Get a look at that horse-tooth, banana-nose jerk." Fucking great. And the angle itself was extremely well done. It was a hell of a way for them to immediately launch into the Flair-Funk feud, coming right out of that white-hot Flair Steamboat program from the spring. And of course, it also set up the injury storyline where Flair was out of action for a couple months. I mean, they were even going so far as to tease the idea that he would have to retire because of the piledriver spot. So that was your big hot program headed into Bash season. And granted, the Bash did not draw very well in '89 because of the lack of company intrigue, especially in the bigger markets. But Flair versus Funk, '89 Great American Bash, that was a huge hit. Probably not as great as the I Quit match from the Clash of Champions 9, but still a great match regardless. I hope I'm not downplaying everything because, you know, again, I'm trying to be cognizant of the fact that I'm in a hotel room right now. I could be screaming off the walls about how fantastic all of this was, but it was. It's really great stuff. It holds up all these years later. It's one of those moments that you go back and watch in time and you don't forget it. You can call almost everything spot for spot. And granted, you know, at this point in the pay-per-view, the show was pretty much over as far as I was concerned. When I look back, I still have no earthly clue why the decision was made to air 2 more matches after this, especially after everything we'd seen in the previous 45 minutes. But for whatever reason, they had this Road Warriors versus Dr. Death and Mike Rotunda World Tag Title match with special guest ref Nikita Koloff. Excuse me? Why the fuck was Nikita Koloff back as a special guest ref for a Road Warriors Varsity Club match? Where did that come from? I don't know. I guess he needed the money. It was probably the most notable thing about the whole segment. That and Kevin Sullivan getting ejected from ringside. You know, I hate to say it, but the whole mystique of the Road Warriors had basically died out by this point. They were just kind of another generic set of guys on the roster at this point. You know, long gone to the days where they were the most over team in the entire business. Like, they're out there having this match with the Varsity Club. It's just a match. Hawk posted himself on the floor at one point, which led to the heels working over the Road Warriors. I mean, the minute you see Hawk and Animal having to sell, it immediately kills everything about their gimmick. And that honestly wasn't even the dumbest part. The dumb part came at the finish when Dan Spivey and Kevin Sullivan showed up to pull Nikita out of the ring as he was going to count the fall for the Road Warriors. They hit Dr. Death with the Doomsday, and then Sullivan and Spivey yanked Nikita out to the floor, wherein they proceed to start attacking him for like 2 minutes. And there's all this melee happening before eventually the bell just randomly sounds for the disqualification. I don't even think Nikita was the one that made the call, even though he was the sanctioned official for the match. And it's basically one of those Lex Luger SummerSlam debacles where Nikita gets in the ring to raise the Road Warriors' arms. Like them actually winning this match meant shit. I mean, they won, but they didn't leave with the belts. But we're all supposed to be happy to see the babyfaces get the W. I just wrote, fuck this nonsense. Like I said, it wasn't even a good match before the lame DQ finish. Still no explanation for why Nikita's randomly back. Maybe they'll talk about it on television. I don't know. And then we had the U.S. Tag Title match with Eddie Gilbert and Rick Steiner defending against Dan Spivey and Kevin Sullivan. Let me repeat what I said earlier. They followed the Flair Steamboat match and the Flair Funk angle with these two tag bouts. They weren't even dark matches. These were actually part of the live pay-per-view feed. Whoever decided that Dan Spivey should have been main eventing a pay-per-view of any description should have had their balls stapled to poster board. Now, at the time I'm recording this, I still haven't gotten around to watching the most recent Dark Side of the Ring documentary with Eddie Gilbert. I know it's been out for several days. I would kind of like to try to go out of my way to find it if I can manage. It is the one downside to not having cable. You know, if I want to watch something, I actually have to go out of my way to seek it out on the internet somehow. It's not to say it made me depressed watching this match, but the thought was on my mind through the entirety of it. Especially seeing Missy out there in his corner. And they actually had a clever little story at play here where the heels injured Rick Steiner before the bell by running him into the ring post, which basically left Eddie to have to work the entire match by himself. And at the end, Rick makes the miraculous comeback where he tries to get the hot tag from Eddie, but Tommy Young waves it off because he didn't see the tag. And then they do the slip on a banana peel finish where Rick gets in the ring and clothesline Sullivan as he's setting Eddie up for a pile driver. And then Sullivan jackknife cradles Sullivan and pins him. And then the heels immediately get some of their heat back by going after the baby faces with a folding chair. Again, not a bad segment, just not something that was able to properly follow what we saw with Flair, Funk, and Steamboat earlier. I truly don't understand what the thought process was. I mean, it'd be one thing to have Flair and Steamboat in the match and then maybe shoot the angle with Flair and Funk at the very end of the pay-per-view. God, to try to follow both of those hot segments with these two tag matches. I mean, it was going to be virtually impossible to care at that point. You're following a gunfight with a slingshot contest. And there were a lot of things that were just kind of off about the WrestleWar pay-per-view in general. Not discounting anything with Flair Steamboat as well as the Flair Funk Heat angle, because that was phenomenal. But, man, outside the Luger-Hayes title match, this was like the first time watching a WCW pay-per-view where it just did not come across like a traditional WCW show. I don't even know how else to phrase it. Like, even some of the more lackluster NWA-themed events we've reviewed in the past, they still had a big fight environment with all the top stars and hot crowds that were into mostly everything, it seemed like. Considering they were in Nashville, I don't know, I kind of expected more with the market. But they were very hit and miss throughout the event. And not to harp on the card, but geez, I still don't entirely understand why this needed to be a 9-match card. It just seemed like so much of the structure to this needed to be rethought. If I had a say in things, I'd have made it maybe a 5 or a 6-match card. Take out the Muta match, take out the Ranger Ross Butch Reed match, the Sting Iron Sheik 2-minute TV title match. I mean, you do Dick Murdoch and Bob Orton in the bull rope match, the Dynamic Dudes and the Samoans in the tag match. Just to get the dudes on the card in some capacity, since you are trying to establish them as one of the young hot teams. Hayes and Luger for the U.S. title. Maybe the 2 tag title bouts that close the show, except you do them before the Flair Steamboat match. And then you make Flair and Steamboat the main event. And then you close everything out with that angle with Funk. That's how I would have done it. And you can rearrange some of those prelim matches to make the order a little more coherent. But, I mean, that was my main takeaway. It was a weird pay-per-view. Very oddly produced from a layout standpoint. Notwithstanding everything I talked about with Funk, Flair, and Steamboat. Alright, so moving on to Midsouth, otherwise known as the Cinco de Mayo edition. Well, we're coming in hot from the Irish McNeil Boys Club with a whole new backdrop for the announce team. We've upgraded from the solid sheet drape. Now we're getting some cool little window panels and just overall a more professional looking background for Jim Ross at the booth. And Midsouth was making bank around this point. Had to figure we were going to see some production upgrades eventually. You know what wasn't an upgrade? Was Joel Watts doing color. Oh, God bless that kid. Good looking young chap. Always did a really nice solid job putting together promo packages and highlight reels. But a commentator he was not. Joel had the type of voice that could have cured insomnia. He actually made my monotone demeanor look tolerable by comparison. Compared to Joel, I sound like fucking Guilford Gottfried. So yeah, this was our first week seeing Joel Watts do color for the program. Unfortunately, it would not be the last. You know, JR tried the best he could to cover. Even he knew that Joel was dying on the vine out there. But, well, you know how that nepotism runs in the family. So they talked about some follow-up to last week's program. Obviously, the big talking point was the Rock and Roll Express becoming the new Mid-South Tag Team Champions. They also talked about the Rock and Roll Win-A-Date contest. The Super Date at the Superdome. The one thing I got a good chuckle out of was hearing JR tell all the single ladies to send in the best picture of themselves so the judges could get a better idea of the competition. And I'm just sitting there thinking, how many titty shots do these anonymous judges have to sift through? Tell you what, I wanted to be on that team. There was just so much sus activity that was going on, and I'm sure they were trying to keep it under the radar as much as possible. I mean, there's no way you could do shit like this in 2025. Promoters would be constantly flooded with nothing but boob and ass shots. In any case, they showed a rock and roll highlight reel to promote the Win-A-Date contest, which actually had a cool little Easter egg, and Joel talked about it on commentary. Apparently, when they were putting together the film of Ricky and Robert driving down the back roads in Tulsa, Joel had been hanging out of the back of the car trying to capture all the footage, and the local Tulsa sheriff had pulled them over because apparently he thought that Joel had some kind of weapon or something. So Joel actually included the footage of the cop car in the video. Hey, what can you do? They were dumb kids just trying to make a living. So, on the topic of the Mid-South Tag Division, we were just touching on the Rock and Roll Midnight Tag Bout last week. And one tag team that had mysteriously fallen off the face of the earth at the beginning of the year was none other than the Bruise Brothers. And we talked about Troy Graham, the Dream Machine. Remember, the idea originally was to bring him and his partner Porkchop Cash in to feud with the Midnights, right before they had entered the program with Magnum and Wrestling 2 for the Mid-South Tag Belts. And unfortunately, Graham had broken his leg right as they were about to shoot the deal with the first confrontation between them and the Midnights on television. So they had to scrap that concept. We never officially saw the Bruise Brothers in Mid-South, outside that one hype package they played where they were walking the streets in their black tuxedos. So they actually threw together a cool little video pre-tape where Troy Graham and Jimmy Hart were outside Graham's home. And obviously Graham's confined to a wheelchair with a giant leg cast. But he got a chance to do a promo and talk about his health status. And it was a super Southern style babyface promo. I actually wrote down this quote verbatim when Troy said, "The rain will come and the wind will blow, but the Bruise Brothers be spreading sunshine everywhere they go." Just fucking great poetry, man. I'll tell you, nobody cuts promos like that in wrestling anymore. Not even close. And the whole premise is that they're trying to rationalize the leg injury as a storyline deal where the Midnights had jumped Troy and broke his leg off camera. And so Troy's talking about how he's thinking about how he's going to dish out his revenge. He will be back. and he will be back to get even. And then Jimmy sort of reiterated that talking point when he told the Midnights that it might be 6 months, 9 months, maybe a full year before Troy Graham makes his full recovery. But they will get the receipt, and JC can bet on that. Really good stuff. Although it's a shame that we never really saw a proper culmination to that feud. Because if you think about it, I mean, the Midnights are basically done in Midsouth by the end of the year, right before they left for Dallas. And I don't ever remember Troy Graham getting back in the ring to wrestle, period, after that injury. So we eventually get the first match on the card. It's Pat Rose and Buddy Landel versus the Rock and Roll Express. Yeah, poor Buddy's back to being used as a prelim enhancement guy. Overall, it's a pretty decent match. I think I counted here. Pat Rose ended up taking like 8 or 9 arm drag takeovers throughout the course of this thing. And he fucked up like 5 of them. There was a little bit of heat on Ricky when he missed a charge in the corner and hit his shoulder. But for the most part, they pretty much controlled the pace of the action. I got a kick out of the finishing sequence after Rob Rose in the middle of his comeback. He goes to shoot Pat Rose off the ropes. And I don't know if this is just bad positioning or if they actually meant for this to happen. Either way, it was funny. Rose inadvertently bumps into Landel, and Landel sort of takes a fall to the outside to sell getting knocked out by his own partner. But it was one of those sells where he didn't over-exaggerate it to make it look like it was a critical part of the match. He just kind of leaned into the ropes and then landed on his feet outside the ring, trying not to draw too much attention to it. And of course, then Ricky and Robert hit their double drop kick on Rose and got the pin. I still hated seeing poor Budrow being used as an underneath guy like that. But the match is fine. And then we came back for Terry Taylor versus Randy Barber, which was a quick enhancement win for Taylor. He's still wrestling with the neck brace on, still favoring the injury after he had been pile driven by Butch Reed on the concrete a few weeks back. Pile driven, pile drived, pile drove. What would the past tense of pile driver be? Pile driven? It would have to be, right? No, whatever. Taylor won with a flying elbow. And that brought us to the special Junkyard Dog interview with JR. One of the more critical stories we heard at the top of the program this week was that Stagger Lee had left Midsouth once again. He had served his purpose of helping Bill Watts battle the Midnight Express. And now he's riding off into the sunset, just in time for JYD to make his big return to Midsouth after he'd been out with a 90-day suspension. So, well, we go to ringside where Dog's talking about going to places like Nashville and Atlanta. Pretty soon he'd be heading up to North Carolina to handle some business. I think he was just doing local talent plugs. And while he's in the middle of all that, out comes Jim Cornette to confront him. And he starts running Dog up the flagpole for, once again, taking advantage of that 90-day suspension clause and returning to Mid-South as Stagger Lee. And worst of all, him showing up at the Superdome to help Bill Watts battle the Midnight Express. And as Jim's getting more and more hostile with Dog, he eventually tells him that he's glad that Butch Reed showed up last week and painted that yellow streak down his back. Because that's all the Dog is. He's a yellow-bellied coward and a bold-faced liar. And that leads to Dog saying that JC just wrote a check that his ass can't cash. At which point he grabs Corny by the neck and goes to lift him up into a chokehold. And I think if I'm correct about this, Corny's talked about this being a pretty well-known moment in his career where he legitimately saw his life flash before his eyes. I guess when they had originally shot this angle, Cornette was not expecting the Dog to have him up in the chokehold for as long as he was. I guess the Midnights were apparently taking way longer to get down to ringside than originally expected. So Dog has Corny up in this chokehold, and I mean, he's up there for a good 15 or so seconds. And if you actually watch Corny's face, you could see him start to lose consciousness right before Bobby and Dennis attack JYD from behind and club him with the tennis racket. I don't think that was a work. I think Cornette was literally on the brink of passing out here. So he's laying on the ground and grabbing at his throat, probably counting his blessings that he didn't have his windpipe crushed. Meanwhile, the heels knock the Dog out with a racket, and then Butch Reed runs out with a bucket of yellow paint. This week, he doesn't even bother using the brush. He just opens that puppy of paint up and dumps the whole god-blessed thing on JYD. And then we get the comical spot right before they cut away where Dennis slips on the paint as the heels try to run to the back. I mean, the heat angle was good. I just remember Cornette's story about him almost getting murdered by JYD on live TV. So that stood out here more than the actual paint job. We then had Mr. Wrestling 2 versus Jason Wacker. And I'll spare you the Wacker comments this week, even though it is still the funniest name I've ever heard in my life. And by the way, that is Hercules Hernandez, in case you're still confused by the whole Mr. Wrestling moniker. The real Mr. Wrestling was on commentary with JR this week, talking about how he's still on the hunt to get even with the Rock and Roll Express, after they allegedly broke into his car, stole his ring gear, and vandalized the vehicle. Hey, the one positive is that it got Joel off the headset, so I'll take it. Hercules went over the torture rack in about 90 seconds. Really not much else to say about it. We had a Dr. Death Steve Williams clip from Oklahoma City at the Myriad Center. And it was him working a spot show match with Jerry Gray. Of course, Bill Watts is doing the dubbed over commentary, so did a great job talking about his background and helping to get him over. I think JR said he's going to be back at the Irish McNeil Boys Club next week. So it was a promotional package more than anything. And then we went straight from that to this in-ring segment with JR and the Rock and Roll hyping up the Super Date at the Superdome contest. Kind of similar to the one a few weeks ago where they took a bunch of women from the crowd and had them all standing around the ring to, shall we say, flaunt themselves. And the big thing that stood out here, no pun intended, Ricky's making a joke about being glad he isn't the one that has to decide on the winner because there's plenty of lovely ladies to go around. And meanwhile, as they're zooming the camera out to show everybody in the shot, you got fucking Big Bertha standing right behind Ricky, absorbing like 90% of the camera shot. I'm sure Ricky was thinking, please don't let it be this broad. I seriously have to wonder what Ricky and Robert were thinking at the sight of having to go on a date with so many of these mid-6s and 7s. And let's be honest here, we don't have to kid ourselves. Most of these girls were very average. Sixes at best. Not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just calling it like I see it. The Midsouth area was not dishing out banger women here in the 80s. At least not from what I'm seeing. We came back for Magnum TA versus Masayo Ito. And the wrestling was alright here, but I just couldn't help but think to myself watching this. Magnum's coming off that white-hot feud with the Midnight Express a couple months back. He was feuding with his former mentor, Mr. Wrestling, over the North American title. And while I know this isn't the end of Magnum's main event run in Mid-South, over the last few weeks, it just seems like Magnum doesn't really have much of a direction going on. Like, you see him on the show working TV matches, but he's not really involved in any of the big angles or the top stories right now. He's just kind of aimlessly toiling around. It's weird. And I said the wrestling here was alright. The match itself was actually very good, considering the drama of what they were trying to get over here. They had Messiah work over Magnum in the claw hold, which Magnum actually bladed for. So we had the blood visual to add to Magnum trying to fight from underneath to make a comeback and end up getting the win with the belly to belly. And that element was well done. People popped huge for Magnum when he won. And it was cool having Terry Taylor down there as moral support. They did a lot of things right here. But again, when you think about what Magnum was previously doing just a few months ago, he just doesn't seem like he's that high of a priority right now in the pecking order. Especially when you compare it to guys like Terry Taylor or the Russians or the Midnights, the Rock and Roll. Right now, Magnum's just kind of a guy. And Masayo Ito at this point is basically fodder. They got their use out of him early on in the beginnings of the TV title tournament. I think at this rate, you're just counting down the days until he leaves the territory. I'm more interested to see how Magnum bounces back after kind of being devalued on recent tapings. Not to make it sound like he's been poorly booked, he's just not really someone they've been prioritizing as of late. Overall, some good stuff on the show. I don't think it's really an episode you need to go out of your way to seek out if you're looking for great content. They moved some story along and shot the deal with the dog in the Midnights. Nothing really game-changing happening this week. Their big marketing campaign right now has nothing to do with anything pertaining to storylines that are upcoming cards. It's all about pushing that super date at the Superdome contest. You can ask me, what is the main draw for the upcoming Superdome show in June? Well, I don't have the first clue what they're trying to promote as a big title match. But by God, they are hyping the hell out of this win-a-date contest. And maybe for the ladies, that's all they needed. There's your hype for the Superdome event. Meanwhile, for all the heterosexual males that just want to see some God-blessed pro wrestling, we're kind of waiting for Mid-South to prioritize that. But I'll tell you who's prioritizing pro wrestling. It's the folks over here in World Class. It is time to talk about the first set of tapings from the 3rd annual Texas Stadium event. And we've covered all three Parade of Champions since we began the World Class Review series. You know, we've seen the huge crowds at Texas Stadium for these annual events. The visual of the fans in these football stadiums is always remarkable. I think nowadays we take it for granted because WWE's packing in football stadium crowds for all the big four events every year. It's a little different with modern eyes. Back in the 80s, when you really didn't see football stadium events all that frequently for pro wrestling, those were some damn cool visuals, especially in the middle of the day. And of course, they're in Texas, so God, it had to have been scorching hot. I don't even want to know what the outside temperature was in Texas during the month of May in 1986. Not the kind of heat I'd want to be wrestling in. So we kickstarted the week with getting to see the big unprecedented handicap showdown. And I use the term unprecedented because that's exactly how Mark Lawrence described it. Yes, handicap matches were considered unprecedented, according to Mark Lawrence. I don't exactly know how he came to that conclusion, because handicap matches had been around for years at that point. I guess he was mainly referring to the stipulation, which was a little unorthodox compared to most handicap bouts. And we briefly touched on the story when we talked about Michael Hayes' promo a few weeks ago. He'd been looking to bring back the great Kabuki to manage him. Part of the intrigue with the handicap match is that Hayes was trying to set a record. Up to that point, nobody had worked a 4-on-1 handicap situation on pay-per-view. So his idea was to have Kabuki help Hayes break that record, and I guess solidifying Hayes as the greatest manager of all time. Or something to that extent. And so that's what we got here. Well, we got the match. I don't know if we got the record setting. That's sort of up to interpretation. But it's Kabuki taking on the team of Mark Youngblood, Jerry Allen, Steve Simpson, and Chris Adams. Yeah, it was weird. They had Chris Adams as a part of this thing. 3 months sitting at home in the UK recovering from a career-threatening eye injury. And he makes his return to world class, and here he is teaming with 3 prelim guys. Now, he did actually wrestle later on. And the rules stipulate that Kabuki has to beat all 4 of these men in under 15 minutes to win the bout. All the opposition really has to do is survive. And right out of the gate, the very first thing I noted about this match, did I never realize how dark-skinned the Great Kabuki was? Or did he have a major tan going on here? He was like brown. If he did tan for this thing, he was using a lot of fucking copper tone. Must have been working with SPF 250. I'm not going to sit here and break everything down spot for spot. I'll just give you the basic outline and we can talk about the bigger picture. Kabuki had an easy time taking care of Youngblood and Allen. He eliminated both of them in well under the 10-minute mark. It was actually more like a gauntlet stipulation where one guy was in the ring wrestling Kabuki, And then once he was eliminated, the other teammate would run down to join the match. But nobody was actually on the apron. And there were no tags. So we get Simpson entering the ring after Allen and Youngblood bit the dust. And as they're working their portion of the match, Simpson's trying to battle out of Kabuki's signature nerve hold. And it leads to him giving Kabuki a sunset flip over the ropes and scoring the 1-2-3. A big shocker to everybody watching, including me. I mean, I was totally convinced that Chris Adams was going to be the deciding factor here. But no. Steve Simpson. He got the W. They didn't even need Chris Adams here. Well, that wasn't until Kabuki tried to attack Simpson after the bell, and then while he and Hayes were double-teaming Simpson, that's when Adams ran down and sent the heels packing. But that was a cool showcase piece for Simpson, I thought. You know, we've been talking about how they've been pushing him on television and having him rack up some wins. So, I mean, when he went out there and scored the upset on Kabuki, I was like, they are definitely invested in trying to get him over. So I guess we see how that carries over to the television show. Now, I've been thoroughly impressed with Simpson. And I remember saying right as he debuted, the name sounded familiar to me when I heard it. I just never recalled much about him. So in a way, this is kind of like watching relatively fresh material. Me kind of seeing world-class attempt to get over a young, hot prospect. And he's good. I wouldn't say he's a prodigy or anything, but you know, he's a solid worker that the people seem to have a genuine interest in. He's much more believable than fucking Lance. So I enjoyed it. And even though Chris sort of had the lasting impression when he ran everybody off, I think the bigger talking point in all this is seeing how they capitalize. Now that Simpson's got a little bit of momentum behind him. And from there, we came back for Steve Regal and Brian Adias for the Texas Heavyweight title. And before you all immediately shower me with hate comments for it being a Brian Adias match, I'm not going to poo-poo it simply because Brian Adias was involved. I'm going to poo-poo it because the match was boring as fuck. Nah, I'm just ribbing. It actually wasn't that bad. It wasn't particularly exciting, but I don't know, I'd say it was a good, solid title match with two guys that know what they're doing. There was nothing wrong with the work. It did kind of devolve into a video game style match where by the end they were just kind of hitting moves on each other, but nothing was really building or escalating until Adias eventually gave Regal the O'Connor roll and scored the win. But like I said, the work was okay. You know, Steve Regal's a tough guy for me to judge. He was never a flashy, overbearing personality, but he was still a reasonably effective heel. I just never really saw a whole lot of prime Steve Regal footage growing up, outside the brief work he did for Crockett. You know, the short while he was there, less than 3 months. I mean, his work in Dallas has been good. I don't really know if he's connected with the crowd like a lot of the top heels. Like I said, part of that issue might be a personality thing. He was just very dry and kind of boring. And while he did a lot of things that you'd expect traditional heels to do, again, it just wasn't as haughty as somebody like a Michael Hayes or a a Jimmy Garvin, a Gino Hernandez. Maybe I just need to catch up on my Florida tapes. Yeah, I'll let you know when I have 5 minutes of extra free time to dive into the Florida library. And then we had John Tatum and the Grappler versus Chris Adams and Brickhouse Brown to close out the taping block. That's another newcomer to the Dallas area we've seen make a name for himself. Brickhouse Brown. He's had a pretty good showcasing in world class. You know, he had that really fun match with Rick Rude on TV a few weeks back. I think that's the one that really put him on the map with the Sportatorium fans. You know, keep in mind, a lot of the stuff they aired this week was mostly prelim material, so you didn't really have these intricate stories behind every match that you saw. You know, Tatum and Grappler have been a solid middle card tag team in world class. I think the brunt of the heat with them comes with anything Missy gets involved with. But the main thing they were trying to get over here was the return of Adams. He's still wrestling with the eye patch on, which surprisingly never really factored into the heat. The heels just kind of worked over Adams, but never really drew attention to the eye. At least until the post-match angle. But it was a good solid back and forth where both teams got to trade offense. Everybody got a little bit of shine at various points. Nothing really stood out in terms of impactful moments. I like the sign in the crowd where someone was poking fun at Missy. It read, "Calling all pigs." And then there was a picture of a pig with Missy's name next to it. It was very creative. And they're quite eager to see the mud showdown with Sunshine. And Adams wound up scoring the win on the Grappler when he caught him with a springboard leap over the ropes. Tatum tried to break it up, but Brickhouse cut him off right before he could do anything. And then the heels got a little bit of heat back afterwards when they targeted Chris's eye. Missy came in and gave him a few slaps to the face before Brickhouse ran everybody off. Again, nothing all that breathtaking. I think this would have worked better as a TV main event on the syndicated show. You know, on the Texas Stadium card, it was just sort of a regular standard prelim bout. I did note at the very end, Missy was hot at somebody in the front row. I don't know what was happening, but she was throwing a tantrum, just yelling for security to kick this woman out. Something must have happened during the match. Apparently something we didn't see, because she was livid. I don't know if they actually ever kicked her out, but it was a pretty hostile situation there for a minute. You know, overall, there's really not much to say about the opening matches. If you're somebody that likes casual wrestling and you like seeing all the big stars in action, you know, this kind of stuff hits home a lot better than it does for the people that are more into the story aspect of everything. The handicap match with Kabuki was fun. Outside that, nothing on the taping block that's really anything special. It is good to see Chris Adams back. He's obviously going to be factored into bigger things down the road. But it was a good way to get him back in the fold. You know, let him get his feet wet after being away for a few months. So we'll just pick up with next week's taping block and see what they dish out on week 2. I guess that'll wrap everything up with that. So folks, thanks for checking out this week's episode. And again, sorry it's a little different than normal. When I'm back in my normal recording room next week, I'll be a little more lively. It's just been a hectic several days and kind of burnt out. But we'll be back on Monday. There will be a Retro Raw review. Unfortunately, I have to briefly touch on the WWE Backlash special, which I don't know how long I'm going to spend talking about all that. But I have to review it. As long as I'm continuing to do these WWE PLE coverages, we'll see. I might max myself out by the end of the year. But until Monday, take care, everybody, and have a good weekend. Peace out.